Hello and welcome to Freedom Watch. I'm Judge Andrew Napolitano here defending freedom, defending your natural rights, and defending your right to have a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. Have the corporations performed a coup of the American government? During the waning days of the Bush administration, while our economic system was falling apart, major corporations like AIG, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, General Motors, Goldman Sachs, and many others sought bailouts of billions of taxpayer dollars from the government, and some of the more politically connected, in fact, received it, while others were allowed to fail. Because there is no oversight of our monetary system, the wealth transfer was allowed to happen, and most conservatives and liberals in Washington bended their knees to their corporate paymasters who fund their campaigns. But where the leaders of the nation have kowtowed, ordinary citizens have begun to stand up and join the ranks of several dozen secessionist groups around the nation, while the whispers of sedition and treason are circulated by their opponents in the media. Lest you think this is some isolated Southern white nationalist movement, consider the Second Vermont Republic, whose platform of secession reads like a socialist platform. It calls for governance similar to Switzerland, with government schools and hospitals and social services administered locally rather than through federal edict from above. Considering that the Constitution of the United States guarantees a Republican, lowercase r, form of government, is it really seditious to assert the right to personal sovereignty and self-government? Joining me now to talk about all this is Lew Rockwell, founder and chair of the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. Lew, it's a pleasure. Welcome here.
Judge, great to be with you as always.
What could possibly be wrong with proposing to a legislature, a state legislature, that a piece of legislation it enacted 100 or so years ago, which gave away some of its sovereignty to the federal government, ought to be repealed because the sovereignty that was given to the federal government has been abused by them?
Well, what's wrong with it is our arrogant masters in Washington don't want to hear the subject raised. In fact, there was a recent incident, you mentioned Vermont. Dennis Steele, who's a secessionist candidate for governor of Vermont, tried to ask a question at a gubernatorial debate about if Vermont seceded from the Union, wouldn't it therefore be free of its proportion of the federal debt? For asking this question, two policemen took him, arrested him, handcuffed him, fingerprinted him, charged him with disorderly conduct, and put him in jail until he got bailed out. So they don't want to hear these kinds of questions raised, but Americans are raising them all across the country, in many, many states. The South, unfortunately, is maybe the most nationalistic part of the country. So this is probably not coming from the South. It's coming from other parts of the country, the West, and as you say, Vermont. People are getting sick and tired of being ruled unconstitutionally and against the natural law by these jokers in Washington. I mean, as Ludwig von Mises said way back at the beginning of the 20th century, no people or part of a people should be held in a political association that it does not want. Well, so there's the principle.
I mean, you're right. I mean, when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, it wasn't just his philosophical musings. It became the law of the land. And I can't quote the entire Declaration of Independence, but there is a clause in there which says that when the government violates the natural rights of the people, when it steals their property, when it takes their liberty, it is the duty of the people, to alter or abolish it. Now, nobody's talking about violence. People are talking about enacting legislation that would alter or abolish it. This is as American as apple pie. This was literally present at the creation. And yet the story you just told us about Vermont is an utter outrage that somebody would be incarcerated merely for suggesting it in a public forum where debate about the government is the cause of the day, where freedom of speech should be the baseline.
And of course, Jefferson mentioned that if people were subject to a long train of abuses and usurpations, they had the right to reconsider their allegiance to the government that was oppressing them. So yes, Americans had that right vis-a-vis the British government, and the people of the American states have their right vis-a-vis Washington, D.C., which makes George III look like a libertarian.
You're right. Were you surprised when Lloyd Blankfein, who's the chair and CEO of Goldman Sachs, was explaining complex economic instruments to members of a Senate subcommittee, it appeared that none of them understood what he was saying, and none of them even understood the questions they were answering. But that's not my point. My point is that he actually said to Senator Carl Levin, we welcome the new regulations that Chris Dodd and Bob Corker have proposed in the Senate and that the president endorsed. What is this phenomenon where the government is so in bed with corporations that corporate executives welcome, not resist like some great people you and I know, but welcome the government hand of control?
Well, this has been true since Teddy Roosevelt and before Franklin Roosevelt. Government regulation is always written with and for the benefit of the big corporations who have influence in Washington. So they love it because it crushes their competitors. So it's no Bob Corker, Senator Dodd, President Obama. These guys are all creatures of Wall Street. They're all funded by Wall Street and the big banks in their campaigns, and that's who they respond to. So the game is they say, boy, we're really going to get you guys. We're really going to get you now because of the problems you caused, when in fact, as Blankfein says, the new regulations are favoring institutions like Goldman Sachs, but crushing smaller institutions and preventing other competitors from ever coming into existence.
Right. In part because the level of surveillance by the government is so pervasive that small businesses would go out of business if they had to comply with, deal with, hire lawyers, accountants, investigators, and economists to interface with the government, whereas the Goldman Sachses of the world have the cash with which to do that and probably have their alumni, if you will, as part of the regulatory team.
Well, that's been true, of course, whether we look at Robert Rubin, the Treasury Secretary, or Henry Paulson, or these guys all came from Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs is very, very close to the Treasury and to the Fed. And one thing we can be sure of, without knowing any of the details, what they're doing is not in the interest of the average taxpayer or the average American citizen, but against our interest. So I think that if we look back, as you mentioned, to that first bailout under the Bush administration, everything that's continued under the Obama administration, I think Americans are sick and tired of it. I think more and more people, they realize they can't influence Washington by electing some bum to replace the previous bum. We need to get out from under.
I mean, this really proves an argument that you've made so articulately, Lew, and a lot of our colleagues have, that we just have a one-party government. Oh, one branch of it seems to prefer more war and more deficits and more assaults on civil liberties, the Republican branch, and the Democratic branch seems to prefer more welfare and more taxes and more assaults on commercial liberties. But when you have somebody like Senator Corker from a place like Tennessee joining hands with somebody like Chris Dodd from a place like Connecticut, it really is only the Ron Pauls in the House and the soon-to-be Rand Pauls in the Senate who will resist this.
Yes, and they're, of course, a tiny minority. So as magnificent as Ron Paul is and those who would join him in fighting this sort of thing, and the leadership that Ron has provided for so many years on all these issues, monetary, fiscal, and otherwise, foreign policy, still we need grassroots revolution, peaceful resistance against a regime that, recently Robert Gibbs, echoing the Energy Secretary, said that the government was going to keep its boot on BP's throat. Wow. So, they want to keep their boot on all of our throats, but we don't have to take it. We don't have to allow them to put the boot in our throats.
Lew Rockwell, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
From New York, defending freedom. Until the next time, stay free, America.